Flight attendant denies a black priest a glass of water, not knowing his family owns the airline. He asked for nothing more than a simple glass of water. The flight attendant looked at him for a fleeting moment before turning away, dismissing him as if he were invisible. She was unaware of his name, oblivious to his story, and had no idea that his family owned the very airline she served. By the time the plane touched down, her entire world would be irrevocably altered. Before we dive into this tale, please share where in the world you're tuning in from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The cabin buzzed softly with the murmurs of passengers, each lost in their own thoughts. As the travelers settled into their seats, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee intertwined with the refreshing chill of the air conditioning. Among them, in the serene enclave of first class, sat Father Daniel Holt, quietly gazing out the window. His fingers rested gently on the armrest, a subtle yet poignant gesture. Clad in a black buttoned-up shirt, a delicate silver chain peeked from beneath his collar, a silent testament to his faith. His presence exuded a calmness that was both unassuming and profound, yet there was an undeniable aura of quiet strength surrounding him. He adjusted his seatbelt and looked ahead, his expression a mystery, holding within it a world of unspoken thoughts. Watched as the attendants shifted up and down the aisle. He had experienced countless flights before, yet this one felt uniquely charged, unlike anything anyone on board could foresee. A few rows ahead, Jessica Vance adjusted her uniform, her keen, practiced eye scanning the cabin. Years of working flights had honed her ability to identify the typical passengers, business executives, high-profile clients, and affluent travelers who demanded nothing short of perfection. But when her gaze fell upon Dorian, a flicker of something deeper crossed her face. Her eyes briefly flashed with a whisper of disapproval, but she swiftly masked it with a veneer of professionalism. As she glided past him without a second glance, she offered warm smiles to others, engaging in polite conversation with passengers who embodied the essence of first class. Dorian remained unmoved. He had witnessed this scene unfold countless times before, more than he wished to remember. The plane doors sealed shut with a definitive click, and the captain's voice resonated through the cabin, announcing their departure as the aircraft began its roll onto the runway. Dorian. He leaned his head back, allowing his weary eyes to flutter shut for just a moment. Sleep had eluded him the night before, and the fatigue clung to him like a heavy blanket. After a few minutes, the flight attendants began their service, pushing carts brimming with drinks and refreshments. The gentle clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversation enveloped the cabin as first-class passengers were presented with their choices: champagne, wine, fresh juice, and sparkling water. When the cart finally reached his row, Dorian opened his eyes, anticipation mingling with his exhaustion. Julia paused beside him, barely meeting his gaze as she poured, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. A glass of sparkling water was offered to the passenger beside him, the older woman seated across from him, Margaret Evans, receiving a polite smile as her drink choice was presented. But when Dorian finally found his voice, it was steady yet resolute. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Julia paused for just a heartbeat before replying in a clipped tone, "We'll be serving drinks later." He cast a glance at the tray in front of her, where glasses of water sat untouched. "You're serving them now." She let out a sigh, the kind that spoke volumes of her irritation. If he had asked for something unreasonable, I would have walked away without a second thought. She pushed the cart forward, leaving him behind, his plea unheard. The other passengers hardly paid attention, a few shifting in their seats, feigning ignorance. Margot paused for just a heartbeat, casting a fleeting glance at him before turning away in haste. Dorian let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming softly against the armrest. He could sense how this would unfold. He wasn't seeking conflict, nor was he here to prove a point, but there were certain things he simply couldn't ignore, would not ignore. Julia poured her heart into her service, ensuring that every passenger in first class received exactly what they desired, yet she never cast a glance back at him, a few rows behind. Haley Parker, a younger flight attendant, observed the exchange with a furrowed brow, sensing the unmistakable dismissal but choosing to remain silent, uncertain if it was her place to intervene. She knew Julia well enough to recognize that confronting her was no simple task. With a heavy heart, Dorian reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a brief message. The message was brief, just a handful of words, yet it carried a weight that lingered in the air. He pressed send and set the phone aside, his face betraying nothing. Deep down, he understood the unfolding drama. He had witnessed it before. But this time, the fallout would not rest on his shoulders. The flight glided on without a hitch, but for Dorian, the atmosphere felt suffocating. He remained still, his body at ease, while his thoughts raced in turmoil. The soft murmur of conversations and the gentle clinking of glasses filled the first-class cabin. Yet Julia was nowhere to be found. She moved purposefully up and down the aisle, tending to drinks, but her absence weighed heavily on him. Others were engaged in light-hearted conversations, ensuring that every passenger felt valued and cared for, except for him. Margot, sitting across from Dorian, stole another glance his way before diverting her attention to her glass, her discomfort palpable. The tension hung in the air, creeping into her consciousness. She had witnessed the unfolding drama, as had everyone around them, yet silence reigned. A few rows back, Hannah observed discreetly, her awareness sharpened by past encounters with Julia. This time, however, something felt profoundly different. She noticed the subtle shifts in Julia's demeanor, the way it morphed depending on her audience, and it stirred something deep within her. It was never just about the service, it was something deeper, something unspoken yet painfully clear. Hannah bit the inside of her cheek, torn between the urge to step in and the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Dorian's phone buzzed softly against the armrest, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his heart racing as he read the response to his earlier message. Noted. Stay seated. Just those two words, devoid of anger or urgency, yet they carried a heavy significance. Dorian's face remained impassive, but a quiet understanding washed over him, settling deep in his chest. He placed the phone down, folded his hands in his lap, and waited, knowing that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. At the front of the plane, Julia pressed on through the cabin, resolutely bypassing the seat she had intentionally overlooked. Guilt was a foreign concept to her. In her mind, the matter was already settled. If he wanted water, he could certainly wait. After all, he was hardly anyone of significance. Yet unbeknownst to her, that seemingly trivial glass of water was on the brink of altering everything. The steady hum of the aircraft enveloped the cabin as Julia navigated her way back to the galley, her posture proud, her movements deliberate. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, a sense of satisfaction washing over her, convinced that the situation had been handled. The man in seat 3A, Dorian, had not caused a stir. He had quietly accepted her response and stayed silent. That was all she needed. In the galley, Hannah was busy refilling a tray of drinks when Julia walked in. The younger flight attendant hesitated, her heart racing before finally speaking up. You skipped him. Julia barely glanced up. Skipped who? Hannah set the bottle down, a frown forming on her face. The man in 3A. He asked for water. Julia let out a weary sigh and shook her head. We have a process, Hannah. I told him we'd serve drinks later. Hannah's frown deepened, confusion and frustration mingling in her expression. But you were already serving drinks. Julia's resolve remained firm. Her gaze sharpened, a sense of unease creeping in. Is there a problem? Hannah hesitated, acutely aware of Julia's demeanor, always sharp, dismissive, and in complete control. Yet something about this moment felt off, gnawing at her instincts. Before she could muster the courage to delve deeper, a sudden crackle from the intercom shattered the tension. Miss Vaugh, please report to the cockpit immediately. Julia stiffened, the unexpected call sending a jolt through her. Flight attendants were rarely summoned to the cockpit unless something was amiss, and she had meticulously ensured that everything was running smoothly. Confused yet composed, she straightened herself, bracing for whatever lay ahead. In her crisp uniform, Hannah caught the attention of those around her, but she only offered a fleeting glance at the galley before striding purposefully toward the front of the plane. As she moved through the first-class cabin, she didn't spare a look for Dorian, who remained still and composed, his steady gaze following her as she vanished behind the cockpit door. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door clicked shut, sealing her fate in a way that took her completely by surprise. Inside, the cockpit was bathed in a soft blue glow from the instrument panels, creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and charged. Captain Reed Lancaster, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, sat in his chair, his hands resting firmly on the controls. Beside him stood Ethan Garrett, the in-flight operations supervisor, his expression a mask of unreadable tension. The moment Julia stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, thickening with an almost suffocating weight. "Is something wrong?" Captain Julia asked, her voice steady, though a flicker of unease twisted in her stomach. Captain Lancaster hesitated, the silence stretching painfully, until Elliot crossed his arms and broke it first. "We received a call from ground control. It appears there's a troubling situation in the first-class cabin that needs some clarity." Julia blinked, her confusion palpable. "I don't understand." Elliot's gaze remained steady, unwavering. A first-class passenger had been denied service. "Would you like to explain why?" Her stomach twisted in knots, yet she maintained a calm facade. "I told him I'd serve him later. I was following procedure." The captain's jaw tightened, a storm brewing beneath the surface. "Were you?" Julia straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of his challenge. "Yes, I had other passengers to tend to first. I wasn't ignoring him." Elliot took a slow breath, the tension thick in the air. She took a breath, gathering herself before speaking again, her voice laced with a sharp edge. "Did you check the flight manifest before assuming he didn't belong in first class?" Julia hesitated for just a heartbeat, enough for Elliot to catch the tension in her clenched hands at her sides. "I didn't assume anything." Elliot's gaze darkened as he rhythmically tapped a small stack of papers against his palm. "Then why is it that every other passenger was served, yet Father Daniel Holt was the only one left waiting?" The name sent a shiver down Julia's spine. "Father?" Her lips parted slightly, but she swiftly concealed her feelings. "I had no idea. You didn't know," Elliot said, his voice devoid of emotion. He shared a look with Captain Lancaster before pressing on. "Did you also fail to recognize that Father Daniel Holt isn't merely a passenger?" Julia felt a lump in her throat. There was an unsettling weight in Elliot's tone. The supervisor leaned in a bit closer, his next words crashing down on her like a heavy stone. "His family owns this airline." An oppressive silence enveloped the cockpit as Julia's heart raced violently beneath her skin. She parted her lips to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Once more grappling with the heavy burden of her error, Julia felt the gravity of the moment. Captain Lancaster's voice, though steady, carried an undeniable weight. "Ground control has been informed. You are to return to the cabin, personally apologize to Father, and serve him whatever he requests immediately." Julia's throat constricted painfully. "Captain, This is not a request," he interjected, his tone sharp as a blade. "Fix this now." For a fleeting moment, Julia hesitated, but the urgency in his voice propelled her to nod resolutely. Without uttering another word, she pivoted on her heel and walked away. Stepping out of the cockpit, Julia felt an unfamiliar weight in her legs as she made her way back down the aisle. For the first time in her career, she was not the one in control. Each step was stiff and calculated, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The captain's words echoed relentlessly in her head. His family owned this airline. It didn't add up. The man in 3A bore no resemblance to the powerful executives she had served in first class before. He wasn't clad in an expensive suit, nor was he flaunting a designer watch. There was no trace of the arrogance she had come to expect from those in power. Someone who once believed they held dominion over the sky now found everything transformed. The passengers, wrapped in their own worlds, hardly noticed her return at first, lost in their conversations. But then she paused beside seat 3A. Dorn remained still, his demeanor calm, hands resting loosely on his lap. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze, his expression a mystery. He didn't appear angry, nor did he seem surprised, and that lack of reaction unsettled her more than if he had been seething with rage. The whispers around them faded as a few nearby passengers sensed the palpable shift in the atmosphere. Julia's throat constricted, yet she summoned the strength to lift her shoulders. She had navigated countless service apologies before, each accompanied by a practiced smile and just the right touch of charm to ease the tension. But this moment felt different. She understood that her usual tactics would fall flat. Taking a shallow breath, she hesitated, almost calling him father, before managing a fragile smile. I wanted to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Dorian remained silent, his gaze fixed on her, and Julia felt the heavy silence stretching like an unbridgeable chasm between them. Her palms began to sweat, clammy, yet she pressed on. It was never my intention to make you feel unwelcome in first class. I should have served you right away. Dorian's eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? It was subtle but undeniably present. He allowed the silence to linger for another long moment before finally speaking. You're saying it was a misunderstanding? Julia nodded quickly, her heart racing. Yes. Dorian tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. And what exactly did you misunderstand? Her breath caught for just a second. The question wasn't aggressive, but it held a weight that enveloped them both. The passengers had completely shifted their focus to the unfolding exchange. Even Margaret Evans, who had remained silent until now, was captivated by the moment. Julia felt her composure beginning to unravel. She had anticipated a swift, impersonal apology. Just a few words, serve the water, and move on. But Dorian was determined not to let her slip away so easily. She forced a tight smile, her heart racing. I assumed you could wait for service. That was my mistake. Dorian's gaze remained unwavering, his voice low yet resolute as he repeated, You assumed I could wait. Did you ask anyone else in first class to wait? Julia's stomach twisted in knots as she sensed the weight of countless eyes upon her. Passengers, crew members, even Hannah, who had stopped near the galley to observe. She hesitated, her heart racing, feeling the pressure of the moment. Dorian leaned back in his seat, his gaze unwavering, and spoke with a calm intensity. If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth. A rush of heat flooded Julia's neck, her usual confidence slipping away, crumbling beneath the heavy burden of this confrontation. For years, she had mastered the art of control in moments like these, but now she was compelled to face the reality of her actions, and the truth loomed large before her. In that moment, escape felt impossible. She swallowed hard, the realization crashing over her like a wave. I misjudged you. Dorian finally averted his gaze, reaching for the glass of water she had just placed before him. He lifted it, taking a deliberate sip, then set it down with a finality that echoed in the silence. His voice remained steady, yet the weight of his words was undeniable. Yes, you did. The conversation had reached its end. Julia stood there, her face aflame with emotion, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. Without uttering another word, she turned and walked back toward the galley, each step heavy with the burden of her heartache. Mistake sinking deep, and for the first time she felt an undeniable truth. This wasn't over. Julia stepped into the galley, her fingers gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath quickened, each inhale a struggle, while the distant chatter from the first-class cabin faded into a muffled echo beneath the relentless pounding in her ears. She had delivered the apology, she had served the water. It should have been the end. But it wasn't. The way Father Daniel Holt had looked at her, with that quiet confidence and calm authority, unsettled her more than any anger ever could. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply pierced through her defenses, leaving her shaken. She hadn't caused a scene, but he had made her feel so insignificant, and that was a feeling Julia was not accustomed to. Across the galley, Haley Parker stood with her arms crossed, witnessing the entire exchange. Julia could sense the heavy weight of Hannah's gaze, filled with unspoken judgment. Finally, Hannah broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension. That didn't go how you thought it would, huh? Julia shot her a glare, desperate for her to back off. But Hannah remained steadfast. You really should have just given him the water. Julia scoffed, grabbing a napkin and wiping down a tray with more force than necessary. And now you're going to lecture me. Hannah shrugged, not a lecture, just an observation. Julia exhaled sharply, shaking her head. It was a simple mistake. It's done. But even as she uttered those words, a part of her felt the weight of their falsehood. The in-flight phone buzzed suddenly, causing Julia to flinch. Hannah arched an eyebrow, a knowing look in her eyes. "That's probably for you." Julia hesitated, her heart racing, before reaching for the receiver. She brought it to her ear, forcing her voice to remain steady. "This is Julia." A calm yet firm voice came through the line. "Ethan Garrett, Miss Vaughn, Mr. Nicholas Hart. I will be waiting at the gate when we land. He wants to have a word with you." Julia's heart plummeted. Nathaniel Hale, Father Dorian, Hale's brother, chief executive officer of the airline. She clutched the phone tighter, her mouth suddenly parched. I understand." The line went dead. Hannah leaned against the counter, her expression a mask of unreadable emotions. Bad news. Julia remained silent, placing the phone down and staring at it, her thoughts racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and now the true consequences loomed just beyond the runway, waiting for her as the flight continued. Continued as if nothing had happened. Yet Julia felt each second stretch painfully longer than the last. Some passengers chatted, others dozed off, while a few tapped away on their laptops. The normalcy of it all twisted her stomach in knots. The thought of Nicholas Hart waiting at the gate echoed in her mind like an unrelenting siren, drowning out everything else. She forced herself to move, to go through the motions of her duties, checking on passengers, straightening trays, and pretending not to notice the subtle glances thrown her way. People had heard. They had seen. She felt their silent judgment bearing down on her, an oppressive weight she couldn't escape. Back in first class, Father Daniel Holt sat at ease, his posture relaxed as he scrolled through his phone. He had sent just one more message since his brief exchange with Julia. "Landing in 1 hour. Let me know if you need anything handled." The reply came swiftly. "Already in motion. See you soon?" Dorian smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. He wasn't a man who relished using his power to make a statement, but there were moments when it was necessary for others. Jessica Vance was on the brink of a lesson that would forever etch itself into her memory. Despite her efforts to distract herself, her nerves overwhelmed her. As she poured a cup of tea for an elderly passenger, she felt her hands tremble, and before she knew it, the steaming liquid spilled over the rim, barely avoiding the man's hand. "Careful," he murmured, instinctively pulling back. Julia's heart raced as she stammered an apology. I'm sorry." She hastily set the cup on his tray and stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. Hannah, observing from a few rows away, could sense the tension in the air. She let out a quiet sigh, feeling a heavy weight in her chest. Julia's unraveling was painful to witness, yet she couldn't bring herself to feel sympathy. As Julia turned toward the galley, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Margot Ellison, her expression deep in thought. The older woman had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, but now her gaze held something that sent a fresh wave of unease crashing over Julia. It wasn't pity, nor was it mere curiosity. It was disappointment. Julia quickly averted her eyes, retreating to the galley, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Just 1 more hour, 60 more minutes. With just 20 minutes left before she would confront Nathaniel, Julia felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, pressing down on her like an unbearable weight she couldn't escape. She struggled to concentrate on her duties, but her hands trembled, betraying her anxiety. The heat of the passengers' silent gazes bore into her, each one a reminder of her earlier mistake. Though no one dared to speak, their silence echoed with unspoken judgment. Julia had faced challenging passengers before. She had stood her ground and asserted herself. Yet this time felt different, and the fear of what lay ahead loomed large in her mind. Asserted her authority when necessary, but this moment felt unlike any other. The passenger she had dismissed was not just another anonymous figure. He was the brother of the man who owned the airline. Now she was bracing herself for the consequences. From his seat, Father Daniel Holt maintained his composure, seemingly untouched by the palpable tension that enveloped the first-class cabin. He was not one to harbor grudges, nor did he take pleasure in watching Julia struggle under the weight of her choices. What truly mattered to him was something far more profound: accountability. His gaze wandered through the cabin, absorbing the hushed responses of those nearby. Margaret Evans, the older woman seated across from him, had been a silent observer from the start. Though she hadn't raised her voice or stepped in before, her expression now spoke volumes. She had witnessed enough to grasp the gravity of the situation. Dorian turned his head just enough to see Haley Parker by the galley. The young flight attendant hadn't done anything wrong, yet the tension in her posture was palpable, her fingers tightly clutching the edge of a service cart. Trey was gripped a little too tightly. Dorian had sensed her discomfort earlier. He had witnessed the instant Julia brushed him aside. Deep down, she recognized it was wrong, yet something held her back. Fear of Julia, fear of complicating the situation. Dorian understood the weight of hesitation, but silence bore its own heavy toll. Meanwhile, Julia felt the pressure mounting with each breath, her once unshakable confidence beginning to fracture the moment she stepped out of the cockpit. Now it was barely holding on, and she found herself in uncharted territory, exposed to the harsh glare of scrutiny for the first time. In a moment of vulnerability, she contemplated approaching Dorian, yearning to offer a heartfelt apology, one stripped of the insincere niceties she had previously employed. Yet something restrained her. Was it pride, stubbornness, or the heavy realization that mere words could never mend the damage she had caused? She pivoted toward the galley, seeking refuge from the piercing gazes that felt like they were searing into her soul. As she entered, Hannah finally broke the silence, her voice laced with concern. "You nervous?" Julia froze, her back still turned, grappling with the weight of her emotions. "Excuse me?" Hannah set a tray down and leaned in closer. Leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "I mean, you do know who Nathaniel Hale is, right?" Julia spun around, her expression taut. "Of course I know." Hannah nodded slowly, "And yet you still thought it was a good idea to act like he didn't belong up here." Julia's fingers curled at her sides. "I wasn't thinking about who he was." Hannah arched a brow. "Exactly." Julia stiffened, but she had no response. She didn't like Hannah's tone. Calm, pointed, not mocking, just matter of fact. And the worst part was that Hannah was right. After a tense pause, Hannah let out a breath, and she shook her head, a mix of frustration and concern in her voice. "You know, I almost stepped in earlier. I nearly told you to just give him the damn water, but I held back." Julia looked at her with wary eyes, curiosity piqued. "And why is that?" Hannah let out a soft chuckle, though it carried no trace of humor. "Because I thought you'd find a way to get yourself into trouble all on your own." Julia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but before she could retort, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The message sent a fresh wave of dread through Julia. This was it. The countdown had begun. She turned away from Hannah without another word, straightened her uniform, and stepped back into the cabin, desperately trying to maintain her composure. But her hands betrayed her, trembling uncontrollably. Julia navigated through the first-class cabin, adjusting seat belts, collecting empty glasses, and putting on a brave face, even though everything felt far from fine. Her body moved on autopilot, yet her mind was a whirlwind, racing with every step closer to landing, each moment heavy with unspoken fears. She felt herself inching closer to Nicholas Hart, a mix of anticipation and dread swirling within her as she contemplated the moment she would finally confront him. Stealing a glance at Father Daniel Holt, she found him lost in thought, gazing out the window as the plane began its descent. His phone lay idle on his lap, and a chill ran down Julia's spine, sensing that he had already dispatched every message that weighed on his mind. The atmosphere around them shifted, palpable and charged, as passengers began to notice the tension. Margaret Evans, the wise older woman who had witnessed it all unfold, turned her gaze toward Julia, her look heavy with unspoken understanding. She walked past, and it wasn't out of cruelty or mockery. It was something far more painful: disappointment. Julia clenched her teeth, her heart heavy, and rushed back toward the galley where Hannah Repter was wrapping up the final preparations. At first, Hannah remained silent, But as Julia reached for a tray, her hand quivered ever so slightly. Hannah noticed and said, "You look like you're about to be sick," her voice lacking both sympathy and malice. Julia tightened her grip on the tray, determination flickering within her. "I'll be fine," she replied. Hannah merely shrugged, a small gesture that spoke volumes, and a thick silence enveloped them, stretching between them like an unspoken tension before Hannah finally broke it. Spoke again, this time with a softer tone. "You know, if you had just treated him like every other first-class messenger, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Julia exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the moment. "And if you felt so strongly about it, why didn't you say something when it happened?" Hannah paused, her gaze locking onto Julia's, and replied, "Because people like you don't listen to people like me." The words pierced through Julia more than she anticipated. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but instead, she turned away, grabbing a cloth and scrubbing at a surface that was already spotless, as if trying to erase the discomfort in the air. Just to keep herself occupied, the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. But before anything could break the silence, the intercom crackled to life once more. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Julia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. This was it. She stepped back into the first-class cabin, forcing herself to concentrate on the passengers, trying to ignore the suffocating pressure building inside her. She checked seat belts, offered polite nods to those who met her eyes, and deliberately avoided Dorian Hale's gaze. He didn't need to utter a single word. His silence spoke volumes. The plane began its descent. As the plane began its final descent, a wave of anticipation washed over Julia, her heart racing as the runway came into view. She instinctively tightened her grip on the back of an empty seat, knowing that the moment those wheels touched down, she would have mere minutes, perhaps just seconds, before confronting Nicholas Hart, who sat across the aisle. Margot, sensing the tension, adjusted her scarf and leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have just given him the water." Julia felt her breath hitch in her throat, the words hanging heavy in the air. She couldn't respond. She was frozen in the moment. The wheels met the ground with a smooth yet resolute thud, marking the beginning of a tumultuous encounter ahead. The passengers erupted into gentle applause, a heartfelt expression of gratitude for finally being back on solid ground. The intercom crackled to life once more, and the soothing voice of Captain Robert Lawson filled the cabin, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. As the announcement echoed through the cabin, urging everyone to stay seated until the gate was reached and the seatbelt sign was extinguished, Julia felt a rush of emotions. She barely registered the words, her gaze fixated on the jet bridge that was slowly coming into view. There, just beyond the glass, stood Nathaniel, tall, unwavering, a beacon of strength amidst the chaos. As Julia waited, her stomach twisted into a tight knot, a sensation so intense she feared she might actually collapse. The situation was about to escalate, and the plane taxied toward the gate, but she could hardly register the movement. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her gaze fixated on Nathaniel Hale standing just beyond the jet bridge window. He appeared perfectly composed, shoulders squared, hands tucked in his pockets, his expression inscrutable. He wasn't tapping his foot in impatience or glancing at his watch. He was simply waiting. That made everything feel even worse. She had faced so much turmoil before. Passengers erupted in frustration, their shouts echoing through the cabin as they demanded compensation, throwing tantrums that were almost predictable. But Nicholas Hart was different. He wouldn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The aircraft glided to a gentle stop, and the familiar sound of the seatbelt sign turning off was drowned out by the usual chaos of passengers scrambling to gather their belongings. Yet Julia felt detached from it all, standing rigidly near the galley, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as she fought to maintain her breath amidst the whirlwind of movement. Father Daniel Holt remained seated, calm and unhurried, a stark contrast to the turmoil surrounding them. As he reached for his bag, there was no urgency in his movements, unlike the others who hurried toward the exit. He simply stood there, his fingers loosely intertwined, and for the first time, Julia felt a desperate longing to plead for another chance. The front door of the plane opened with a sharp hiss, and Nathaniel stepped forward. The first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances while others feigned indifference to the man who held the power over the very airline they had just traveled with. His presence was palpable, resonating even with those who were unaware of his significance. In that moment, Nathaniel stepped just inside the plane, his eyes sweeping across the cabin before locking onto Dorian. The two brothers shared a fleeting glance, a mere second that felt laden with unspoken understanding. Nathaniel's gaze then shifted, landing unwaveringly on Julia. She felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her, almost causing her to retreat, but she steadied herself. She was not weak. She had navigated this industry for years, faced countless challenges before. She could find a way to talk her way out of this. She just needed to tread carefully. At first he hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the flight supervisor, Ethan Garrett, who had just entered the plane behind him. "Make the passengers exit smoothly," Nathaniel instructed, his voice steady and composed. Elliot responded with a subtle nod, already signaling for the crew to help. Nathaniel stepped closer to Julia, who swallowed hard, straightening her posture. "Mr. Hale, she began, but he raised a hand, silencing her immediately. The plane was still filled with passengers, some feigning indifference, yet all were acutely aware of the tension in the air. Nathaniel remained unfazed. He raised his voice, and when he spoke, the authority in his tone sent a wave of unease through Julia, making her stomach churn. "Walk with me now." Her breath hitched. This was far worse than she had ever imagined. He wasn't merely addressing the situation in front of everyone. He wanted her to step off the plane with him. The walk down the jet bridge felt like an eternity, longer than any flight she had ever taken. Nathaniel didn't even glance at her as they moved, and that silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, suffocating. Julia's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she feared he might hear it as soon as they stepped into the private executive lounge. Near the gate, Nathaniel shut the door behind them, and in that instant, everything shifted. The tranquility evaporated. Nathaniel turned to face her, his expression transforming into a tempest of quiet intensity. "You really thought no one would notice?" His voice, though not raised, carried a weight that struck like a hammer. Julia felt her throat constrict. I didn't." Nathaniel took a deliberate step forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Let's not waste time with excuses, Miss Vaughn. A priest, a man devoted to serving others, asked for something as straightforward as a glass of water, and you chose to believe he wasn't worth it." Julia's breath hitched in her throat. The way he articulated it made it feel so much more painful, and yet wasn't that precisely what had transpired? Nathaniel let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disappointment. "You could have chosen differently. You could have shown him the same kindness you offered every other first-class passenger, but you didn't." Julia felt the last remnants of her confidence shatter. "Mr. Hale, I realize I made a grave mistake." Nathaniel's jaw clenched tightly. "No, a mistake is simply forgetting a drink." The weight of the decision twisted in her stomach. Nathaniel folded his arms, his voice dropping to a low, intense tone. "If he had been wearing a suit and an expensive watch, would you have told him to wait?" Julia's silence spoke volumes, and Nathaniel let the moment stretch, observing the dawning realization on her face. She understood she had no defense, no way to justify her actions. "Do you know how many times people like my brother have been dismissed by people like you?" His voice remained calm, but the simmering anger beneath was palpable. "How many times has he been made to feel like he doesn't belong, Julia?" Nathaniel stood there, his silence heavy in the air, before finally delivering the crushing news. "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full review by the executive board." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Suspended without pay. Years of dedication, countless hours spent building her career and reputation, all seemed to shatter in an instant. Nathaniel's voice remained cold and unyielding. "I don't expect you to understand this right now, Miss Vaughn, but perhaps when you're at home, grappling with how everything unraveled so quickly, you'll reflect on the choices made." In an instant, you brushed aside someone for something as simple as a drink of water. Julia felt the oppressive weight of the room closing in on her, the stifling truth of the moment crashing down. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. His voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding. Julia barely managed to lift her gaze. You will personally file an incident report detailing every single thing that happened. No edits, no softening the truth. And when the board reads it, they will determine if you ever deserve to set foot on one of our flights again. A frigid shiver coursed through Julia, and she parted her lips, desperate to plead for another chance. Yet deep down, she understood it would change nothing. Nathaniel regarded her for a fleeting moment before moving toward the door. I hope, he said, pulling it open, that this is the last time I ever have to hear your name. With those words, he stepped out, leaving Julia alone in the desolate room, the crushing weight of her decisions enveloping her. She remained frozen in the executive lounge, her heart racing so fiercely it felt as if it might explode from her chest. The door had shut behind Nathaniel Hale, yet his words lingered in her mind, haunting her. Suspended without pay, pending a full review, her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She had anticipated trouble, but this was more than just a slap on the wrist. It felt like the end of everything she had worked for. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, trembling with disbelief. How had it all unraveled so quickly? One fleeting moment, one thoughtless decision, and now she found herself alone in an empty room, watching her future disintegrate before her eyes. A lump rose in her throat, but she fought it back. She had poured her heart and soul into this. For 35 long years, she had meticulously crafted an image of unwavering control, poised authority, and an untouchable presence. Yet now, for the very first time in her illustrious career, she found herself utterly powerless. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the empty conference table before her, the same table where airline executives had made life-altering decisions about employees like her. Who would stay, who would leave, and who might be granted a second chance? Would she even be afforded that opportunity? Her mind raced with a whirlwind of possibilities. Could she fight this? Argue that it was all a misunderstanding? Perhaps if she articulated her side more clearly, the board would finally understand her plight. This moment felt like a devastating blow to her career. Yet deep within, she understood the painful truth. Nathaniel Hale hadn't spoken out of anger. His words were carefully chosen, deliberate, and irrevocable. She had been cast aside, and there was nothing left for her to do. Suddenly, her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed into one of the vacant chairs, her hands pressing against her forehead in despair. For years, she had navigated airports with unwavering confidence, her uniform immaculate, her head held high. Passengers admired her, and her fellow flight attendants looked up to her. She had once been someone significant, but now she felt like just another nameless employee, anxiously awaiting the news of whether she would ever work again. A gentle knock on the door jolted her upright, her stomach twisting in a knot. For a fleeting moment, she feared it was Nathaniel, returning to deliver the final crushing blow. But when the door swung open, it revealed Ethan Garrett, the in-flight supervisor. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his expression a mask of uncertainty. Yet the way he exhaled before speaking conveyed everything Julia needed to understand. This was serious. "This is bad, Julia." His voice was steady, yet the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Unkindness hung in the air as she swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the chair with trembling hands. "I know," Elliot said, crossing his arms, his gaze unwavering. Julia's jaw tightened, the defensive instinct rising within her. "It was just one mistake, Elliot." He didn't react, just tilted his head slightly, challenging her. "Would you still call it that if it had happened to someone else? If another flight attendant had treated a first-class passenger that way?" Julia's nails dug into the fabric of the chair, a physical manifestation of her turmoil. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, but he cut her off, his voice steady and unyielding. "You need to accept that, Julia, because if you try to fight, if you sit in front of the board and play the victim, they'll dismiss you without a second thought." A sharp pang of panic pierced through Julia's chest. Elliot sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. "Do you even grasp the weight of who you humiliated today?" Julia flinched at his words. I know who he is now. Elliot let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. It's not just about who he is, it's about what he stands for. His voice softened, filled with gravity. You didn't merely refuse service to a random passenger. You turned away a man of faith, a man who has dedicated his life to advocating for those in need. Treated unjustly, a man whose family had poured their heart and soul into building this airline. Julia felt a tightness in her throat as Elliot exhaled, reminding her, and let's not forget the passengers who witnessed everything unfold. They saw you attend to everyone else while you turned your back on him. You don't think at least a few of them have already penned complaints? The realization hit Julia like a wave. She hadn't considered that. Her stomach plummeted at the thought. One complaint from a passenger was a concern, but a flood of complaints? That was undeniable evidence. The weight of it all bore down on her, and for the first time since she had stepped off that plane, Julia felt a profound sense of dread. A sense of fear crept in, and she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "What do I do?" Elliot studied her intently for what felt like an eternity. "That depends," he replied, his tone steady. She swallowed hard. "On what?" "On whether or not you're actually sorry," he said simply. Julia felt a chill run through her as she stiffened. Elliot leaned in slightly, his gaze piercing. "You can write your report, follow protocol, and cling to the hope that the board will be lenient, or you can face the one thing you've never had to confront before." Julia frowned, confusion etched on her face. "And what's that?" Elliot's next words hit her like a heavy stone, sinking deep into her chest. "Admit that you were wrong," he said, and she fell silent, for the first time in years, utterly speechless. Julia sat frozen in her chair, Elliot's words enveloping her like a heavy shroud she wasn't ready to bear. Admit that you were wrong. The thought twisted painfully within her, foreign and unsettling. She had spent years asserting herself, standing resolutely in every circumstance, never yielding unless it was absolutely necessary. But now she found herself confronted with the heartbreaking reality that the only path to saving her career demanded she relinquish the very essence of who she was. With a sense of triumph, she inhaled sharply, her control slipping away. "I never intended to be unkind." Elliot remained silent, merely observing. "I didn't mean for it to feel personal," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I was overwhelmed, managing a full cabin, and I didn't think." Elliot exhaled slowly, his breath heavy with understanding, before he spoke. "And that's the issue." Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair tightly. "I've witnessed others attempt to sneak into first class before," she continued, "but I assumed—" Elliot's jaw clenched at her words. "You assumed," he echoed, and Julia flinched, realizing that was the part she didn't seem to grasp. "Understand," Elliot continued, his voice steady yet piercing. "You assumed he didn't belong, and because of that misguided belief, you treated him with disdain." Julia opened her mouth to protest, but what could she possibly say? Elliot leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "You think this is merely about you? About your job?" He shook his head, disappointment etched across his features. "You didn't just make a poor decision, you shattered the dignity of a man who didn't deserve such treatment. You humiliated someone who has dedicated his entire life to standing up for those who have been overlooked, just as you overlooked him." Julia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you know what makes this even more painful?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This wasn't just about money. It was so much deeper than that. You weren't holding back some special service or a simple upgrade. All he asked for was water. That was the part that hurt the most. Water, something so fundamental, something she would have freely given to anyone else." Elliot observed the flicker of realization wash over her face. "Now you're starting to understand," he said. Julia exhaled shakily, pressing her palms against her knees. "I didn't think it would come to this," she confessed. "You never do," Elliot replied, and a heavy silence enveloped them. Suffocating Julia had always taken pride in her ability to maintain control, but now everything was slipping through her fingers, faster than she could comprehend. She clenched her jaw, frustration boiling inside her. You think an apology will fix this? Elliot studied her intently, his gaze unwavering. No, he replied honestly, but it's a start. She scoffed, bitterness lacing her words. Right, I'll just apologize, and Nathaniel Hale will forgive me, and everything will magically return to normal. Elliot raised an eyebrow, questioning her hope. Julia's throat tightened. What was she truly hoping for? A second chance? For all of this pain to vanish into thin air? Or was she simply searching for a way to escape this situation with a shred of her dignity still intact? She remained silent, and Elliot let out a heavy sigh, leaning back. You still don't understand, do you? The apology isn't meant for them. It's for you. Her brow furrowed in confusion. What does that even mean? Elliot studied her intently, weighing whether she could truly grasp the weight of his words. Because if you don't take ownership of this, if you don't confront what you've done and genuinely learn from it, then this moment will haunt you for the rest of your life. You'll walk away from this airline, but the burden will follow you. Go somewhere else, and one day you'll find yourself repeating the same mistake. Perhaps not on a plane, perhaps not concerning water, but it will inevitably occur. Julia felt a pang of anguish as those words struck her, for deep down she recognized the truth in them. She had never truly considered how she treated certain passengers. It had always been instinctive. Who received a warm greeting, who got a mere nod, who she beamed at, and who she let slip by unnoticed. It had never crossed her mind until now. But now she was left with the weight of realization as Elliot stood up, the board awaiting your incident report As the day drew to a close, Julia found herself grappling with the weight of her choices. She hesitated, her heart racing, and when she finally spoke, he turned to her, his expression a mask of indifference. Then this is the end of your career, he said, his voice steady, devoid of malice but heavy with finality. It wasn't a threat, it was a chilling promise. Julia remained seated, feeling the air grow thick with the truth she had desperately tried to evade during the flight. For the first time in years, the mirror reflected only her own failures. Alone in the executive lounge long after Elliot had departed, she sat in silence, her mind a chaotic storm of thoughts she was terrified to confront. The walls around her felt suffocating, closing in like a heavy fog, and for the very first time in her career, she sensed the sting of being an outsider in an airport that had always embraced her as home. She had woven her life among the clouds, pouring herself into the long hours, the relentless travel, and the uniform that once wrapped her in a comforting sense of control. It was her entire world, and now it was all unraveling, slipping through her fingers because of a fleeting moment she had barely registered at the time. But now it consumed her thoughts, the weight of it pressing deeper into her chest as she reached for her airline-issued tablet. Feeling the gravity of her situation settle in, her fingers hovered anxiously over the screen, the incident report already open, a silent invitation for her to share her truth. The cursor blinked before her, a relentless reminder of the weight of her silence. What could she possibly say? She could weave a comforting lie, soften the harsh edges of reality, and paint it as a mere misunderstanding. How overwhelmed she had been, how she had intended to serve Father Daniel Holt, but had let herself be distracted. Yet the truth loomed heavy in her gut, a stone that refused to be ignored. She hadn't forgotten him. She hadn't been too busy. She had seen him and chosen to turn away, and that knowledge gnawed at her conscience. Her fingers gripped the tablet tightly, Nicholas Hart's words reverberating in her mind. A mistake is forgetting a drink order. This was so much more than that. Julia shut her eyes, letting out a slow, shaky breath. She had dedicated her entire career to making quick, instinctual judgments about people, taking pride in her ability to discern who truly mattered, who deserved that extra effort, and who did not. And now she found herself confronted with the painful truth. She had been wrong. With a heavy heart, she opened her eyes and began to type. Incident report. Jessica Vance on Flight 482. I was entrusted with delivering first-class service during drink service, and I made sure to provide beverages to every passenger, except for Father Daniel Holt. When he asked for a glass of water, I told him I would attend to him later, but I continued to serve others, intentionally overlooking his request. My hands trembled over the keyboard as I approached the next part, which was the most challenging. My choice was not rooted in standard protocol. It stemmed from an unverified assumption. I didn't check his ticket or the manifest. I simply saw him and made a judgment about whether or not he deserved my attention. That decision was not based on policy or training. It was a judgment I made entirely on my own. Her throat tightened as she stared at the words, and everything inside her screamed in resistance to the truth. For years, she had constructed her career on the foundation of control, never allowing doubt to creep in, always standing resolutely by her choices. But now, for the first time, she was confronted with the weight of one of those choices. She forced herself to press on. This was not a misunderstanding, nor an accident. I chose to dismiss him. I understand now that my actions it wasn't merely a failure in customer service. It was a profound lapse in basic human decency. Her fingers quivered slightly as she typed the final words. I accept full responsibility for this decision and its consequences. She exhaled slowly, her breath shaky, as she reread her message. No excuses, no justifications, just the raw truth. Her hands lingered over the screen for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed submit. The instant the report was sent, an unexpected wave of relief washed over her, though the heaviness in her chest remained. Disappear, but for the first time since the flight, the suffocating coil of anxiety that had been crushing her ribs began to loosen ever so slightly. She couldn't erase the past, but at least now, she wasn't desperately trying to ignore what had transpired. A sudden, sharp knock on the door jolted her back to reality. She turned just as the door swung open, and her stomach twisted in knots at the sight of the last person she ever expected to see. Father Daniel Holt. He stood just inside the doorway, his expression a mystery, his presence enveloping the room with a quiet, commanding authority. He wasn't wearing his priest collar, just a simple buttoned-up shirt and slacks, yet there was an undeniable presence about him that demanded more respect than any suit could ever convey. Julia sprang up from her chair, her heart racing and her throat dry. Father Hale Dorian studied her intently for a moment before stepping closer. Nathaniel told me you submitted your report. She swallowed hard, nodding. I told the truth. Dorian tilted his head slightly, his unwavering gaze piercing through her. And why is that? Julia's fingers curled nervously. She could have given an easy answer, could have shared what was on her mind, but the weight of the moment held her back. He longed to listen, yet she found herself revealing something genuine, for she had finally come to terms with how deeply she didn't want to. She confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, and therein lay the heart of the matter. Dorian paused, absorbing her words, then nodded slowly. Good. It was a simple word, yet it bore a weight she hadn't anticipated. Julia faltered before continuing. I know it doesn't erase my actions, but I am truly sorry. Dorian let out a heavy breath, crossing his arms as he scrutinized her. Do you have any idea how many times I've faced that kind of neglect? Julia swallowed hard. More than you should have. Nodded more than anyone ever should have, allowing the weight of his words to linger in the air before he pressed on. What you did was wrong. You allowed an assumption to dictate how you treated someone. That's not something you can simply erase. Julia steeled herself, bracing for the moment he would tell her she didn't deserve forgiveness. But instead, he said something that left her utterly stunned. But if you truly meant what you wrote in that report, if you genuinely grasp the gravity of your actions, then you have a chance to ensure you never repeat this mistake. She blinked, taken aback. You think I deserve that chance? Dorian's expression held steady, a calmness that contrasted with the turmoil in Julia's heart. That's not my decision, he stated. Julia frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Then who is it? Dorian met her gaze, his voice unwavering, yet filled with weight. Yours. His words hung in the air, heavier than she could have anticipated. This was no longer just about the airline's choices or the decisions made by Nathaniel or the executive board. It was a profound moment of truth about her own character and the kind of person she wanted to become. Dorian glanced at his watch, the urgency of his next meeting pressing upon him. He turned toward the door but paused, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. One last thing, Julia held her breath. Breathe, Dorian urged, his voice soft yet resolute. If you're given a second chance, make sure you earn it. With that, he walked away, leaving Julia in solitude once more. She sank back into her seat, her gaze fixed on the door long after it had shut. For the first time since this journey began, her thoughts drifted not to the future ahead, but to the person she hoped to become if fate granted her the opportunity to remain. Julia lingered in the stillness, her heart racing, the echoes of Dorian's words swirling in her mind, hung in the air like a haunting echo she couldn't escape. If you're granted a second chance, make sure you truly earn it. It should have brought relief, a flicker of hope, but instead, it felt like an unbearable weight. For the first time, the burden of change rested heavily on her shoulders. She was unaccustomed to this feeling of being wrong, of facing accountability. Years spent brushing off mistakes, defending her choices, and standing firm in every judgment, right or wrong, had defined her. But now that version of herself, the invincible Julia Vow, was beginning to fade away. Away, and what filled her with dread was the uncertainty of what lay beneath. She let out a shaky breath, her hand trembling as it brushed over her face. She had been honest in her report, bravely owning up to her mistakes and recognizing her assumptions. For the first time, she had allowed herself to see through the eyes of others. But was that truly enough? Would the airline find it in their hearts to forgive her? Did she even deserve their forgiveness if it came? Her tablet buzzed on the table, jolting her back to the present. She hesitated, her heart racing as she glanced at the sender. Nathaniel. Her hands felt. With a sense of awkwardness, she tapped the notification, her heart racing as the screen illuminated with a brief yet powerful message. Julia 5 on the executive board has reviewed your report. You are required to meet in conference room B at 5 p.m. At that moment, a crucial decision about your future will be determined, Nathaniel. Julia glanced at the clock. It was 4:12 p.m. Less than an hour, and her stomach twisted in agony. She had sensed this moment approaching. The report was merely the beginning. Now she had to confront the inevitable. As she placed the tablet down with trembling hands, a wave of anxiety washed over her. What would their decision be? Would they fire her, extend her suspension, or perhaps grant her a second chance, one she wasn't even sure she deserved? The mere thought constricted her chest. A sudden knock on the door startled her, and she looked up, anticipating Elliot or another supervisor. Instead, it was Haley Parker. Julia blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected visitor. "What are you doing here?" Hannah stepped inside, gently closing the door behind her. "I heard you submitted your report," Julia said, her brow furrowing slightly. "News travels fast." Hannah offered a small shrug, her eyes reflecting a deeper understanding. "People are watching. They want to see what happens to you." The words hit Julia harder than she expected, causing her to look away. "Well, they'll find out soon enough. I have a meeting with the board in less than an hour." Hannah studied her intently, a weight in the air between them before finally asking, "What did you write?" Julia hesitated, feeling the pressure of the moment. It would have been so easy to downplay it, to pretend it was it felt like just another routine corporate formality. Yet there was something in Hannah's gaze, a silent expectation that weighed heavily on Julia's heart. Lying seemed like it would only deepen the chasm between them, so for the second time that day, she chose to bare her soul. "I told them everything," Julia confessed, her voice trembling with vulnerability, quieter than she had intended. "I admitted that I ignored him, that I judged him. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision." Hannah paused, her reaction slow and her tone inscrutable. "Why did you do that?" Julia exhaled slowly, the truth finally dawning on her. "Because I finally realized the weight of pretending it didn't happen pressed down on me, and I knew it wouldn't save me." Hannah's expression softened just a bit, but she wasn't about to let Julia off the hook so easily. "You really believe that?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." A silence stretched between them, but for the first time it felt different, not hostile. Then a small smirk played on Hannah's lips. So how does it feel? Julia frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. How does what feel? Realizing you're not the smartest person in the room. Julia exhaled, shaking her head, and met Hannah's gaze. Honestly, it feels terrible. Hannah chuckled softly, leaning against the wall, the moment hanging heavy with unspoken truths. It's a relief, really. Maybe this time you'll actually take something away from it. Julia sighed, her voice lacking its usual sharpness as she asked, Are you always this annoying? Hannah's grin widened. Only when people deserve it. Julia let out a weary laugh, the first genuine one she'd managed all day. In that moment, everything clicked. She finally understood why Hannah had kept such a close eye on her during the flight, why she had spoken up in the galley, why she hadn't let Julia's actions go unnoticed. It wasn't about wanting to see her fail, it was about hoping to witness her transformation. And now Julia realized she wanted that change too. The clock. The clock on the wall ticks ever closer to 5 p.m., each second echoing the anticipation in the air. The moment of truth was approaching, and for the first time since she had disembarked that plane, Julia felt a surge of readiness to confront it. She sat outside conference room B, her hands resting on her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles had turned ghostly white. The agony of waiting was overwhelming. Each second dragged on endlessly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had faced high-pressure situations before, calming irate passengers, managing in-flight crises, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. This moment weighed heavily on her heart, for it transcended merely navigating a challenging circumstance. It was deeply personal. The glass walls of the executive corridor offered her an unobstructed view of the airline's highest decision-makers gathered within the conference room. Nicholas Hart occupied the head of the table, flipping through the report she had painstakingly submitted. Beside him, Ethan Garrett, the in-flight supervisor, sat with his arms crossed, a tense silence enveloping him. A few board members, including the airline's director of operations, were also present, their expressions inscrutable. Julia summoned every ounce of strength to maintain her composure. Breathe. She was engulfed in uncertainty as she stepped into that room. Would they rip her to shreds? Would they dismiss her immediately? Or even more terrifying, would they offer her a second chance, demanding she prove her worthiness? A voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. You look like you're about to pass out. Julia turned abruptly to find Haley Parker a few feet away, arms crossed, an expression on her face that was almost playful. Julia let out a shaky breath, shaking her head. I don't need an audience for this. Hannah leaned against the wall, watching her intently. The wall, I'm not here for you. I was meeting with my supervisor, but then I noticed you sitting here, looking as if you'd rather be anywhere else. Julia didn't protest because Hannah was spot on. Hannah observed her for a moment before continuing. Do you want to hear something intriguing? Julia sighed, not really in the mood. Hannah pressed on. Nathaniel Hale has let go of 6 senior flight attendants in the past 3 years, all for reasons far less significant than this. Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. That's not comforting. Hannah tilted her head slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. You know what they all shared in common? Julia glanced at her with a weary expression. They refused to take responsibility for their actions, Hannah said simply. They argued, pointed fingers, claimed the passengers were overreacting. Julia swallowed hard. And what happened to them? Hannah shrugged. They entered that room with a defense and left without a job. Julia exhaled, rubbing her temples in frustration. Great, fantastic. Hannah smirked. But you don't have a defense, do you? Julia hesitated, then shook her head. A quiet no. Hannah's smirk faded. Good for once, Julia. A sharp click pierced the air as the conference room door swung open. Nicholas Hart's assistant emerged, casting a quick glance at Julia. They're ready for you. Julia's heart raced, pounding fiercely against her ribs. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling heavy, and turned to Hannah one last time. Hannah raised an eyebrow, a hint of concern in her gaze. Try not to get fired. Julia exhaled, uncertainty creeping in. Not sure that's up to me. Hannah's expression softened just a fraction, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe it is. But Julia didn't have the luxury of pondering what that meant. With a deep breath, she stepped into the conference room, the door closing behind her, with a finality that echoed in her chest. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocating. Nicholas Hart sat at the head of the long table, his expression a mask of inscrutability. The board members observed her intently, some with a flicker of disinterest, while others scrutinized her with piercing gazes. Elliot sat to the side, arms crossed, a silent sentinel waiting for the unfolding drama. Julia had never felt so diminutive, so exposed. Nathaniel wasted no time. He commanded her presence, and Julia complied without a moment's hesitation, lowering herself into the chair directly across from him. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together in a gesture that felt both authoritative and intimidating. "You submitted your report," he stated, and Julia nodded, her heart racing. "Yes." The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Nathaniel's gaze was unwavering as he spoke again. "Do you stand by what you wrote?" Julia felt a lump in her throat, struggling to maintain her composure. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, his presence commanding. "You admitted that you made an assumption about a passenger, that your actions weren't guided by protocol, but by personal judgment." Julia fought the urge to look away, her heart racing. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. One of the board members, a woman with an intense gaze, tapped her pen against the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "Do you understand why this is serious?" Julia nodded, her heart heavy. "Yes, because my actions weren't just a failure in service. They revealed a much deeper issue. It never crossed my mind until this very moment." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, curiosity etched on his face. "And what issue is that?" Julia inhaled deeply. The word felt so foreign on her tongue, yet it was undeniably the truth. Nathaniel observed her intently. "So you admit that's what this was?" Julia clenched her hands tightly in her lap, the weight of her confession heavy in the air. "I admit that I made a judgment about someone based solely on my own assumptions, and I treated him differently because of it." A long silence enveloped the room. One of the other board members, a man in his 60s, let out a weary sigh and leaned back, the gravity of the moment settling in. "We've seen flight. In moments like these, attendants often become defensive, scrambling to justify their actions." Julia felt a knot twist in her stomach, yet she remained silent. Nathaniel observed her intently for what felt like an eternity before finally breaking the silence. "Your employment is under review," he stated, his tone firm but not unkind. "However, let me be clear. You are already one step ahead of everyone who has sat in that chair before you." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean?" she asked, her heart racing. Nathaniel leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "It means you didn't waste our time making excuses." She let out a slow exhale, the tension still gripping her chest. "So what now?" she inquired, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "You are officially suspended for 4 weeks unpaid." The weight of those words crashed down like a heavy storm. A month without work, without income, without the familiar comfort of her uniform. Yet she summoned every ounce of strength to accept this harsh reality. Anil continued, "When your suspension is over, if you choose to return, you will need to complete bias training, customer relations courses, and endure a probationary period before you can be reinstated." Julia let out a shaky breath, her heart racing. "So I still have a job?" Nathaniel's gaze intensified. "You have a chance to prove you deserve one." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a stark reminder of the consequences she now faced. An opportunity. Julia swallowed hard, the lump in her throat heavy with emotion. "I understand." Nathaniel studied her for what felt like an eternity, before he nodded. "Then this meeting is over." Julia stood slowly, her legs trembling as she turned to leave. But Nathaniel's voice cut through the silence once more. "One more thing." She paused, turning back, her heart racing. Nathaniel's expression was a fortress, impenetrable. "I hope you understand that this is not for you." A frown creased her brow. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel's voice was calm, yet unyielding. This isn't about saving your career. It's about proving that you actually learned. Something within Julia stirred as the words nestled deep in her chest. Nathaniel leaned back, a sense of finality in his voice, urging her not to waste this moment. Julia nodded, her heart racing, and stepped out of the room. She had 4 weeks to discover who she was meant to be, and for the first time in her career, she felt an openness to learn. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this. The story of Father Daniel Holt and Jessica Vance teaches us that prejudice can have serious consequences. Jessica hastily judged Daniel based on his appearance, ignoring fairness, putting her at risk of losing her job. The lesson is that treating everyone with respect and equality, regardless of appearance or status, is the foundation of ethics and professionalism. Prejudice not only hurts individuals, but also destroys trust in communities. In modern American society, where diversity is valued, prejudice remains a challenge, especially in the service industry. The story reminds us to examine our personal assumptions and practice empathy. In the workplace, respecting everyone helps create an inclusive environment and reduces conflict. In life, avoiding hasty judgments and standing up for justice when we see injustice strengthens relationships in an open society. By applying this lesson, we can help create a fair America where human values are respected.